The first line told me I was already too late. The second line used my name, my full name, including the middle name I stopped using after my father died. No one at the archive even knew it existed. The third line was written in ink that was still drying. I watched it spread. The ink feathered slowly into the paper fibers, thin black veins crawling outward like frost patterns forming across glass. I remember leaning closer, convinced that if I stared long enough, I would see the moment the writing stopped, the moment whoever, or whatever, had written it finished the final stroke. But the ink never stopped moving. It just slowed, as if settling into permanence. I work in restricted archival containment. Not religious censorship. Not government secrecy. The documents we isolate are removed because they cause measurable psychological destabilization. Some induce fixation. Others produce recurring auditory hallucinations. A handful have caused coordinated behavioral patterns among unrelated readers, separated by geography and time. We don't destroy those texts. We preserve them. Quarantine requires preservation. The folder should have had 3 identifiers: catalog classification, contamination risk index, and authorization seals. It had none. It sat centered on my desk, aligned perfectly with the grain of the wood surface, placed with deliberate care. I am meticulous about workspace order. Whoever said it there understood my habits well enough to mimic them. I checked hallway surveillance later. No one entered my office between 12:42 p.m. when I left for lunch and 1:16 p.m. when I returned. The folder appeared anyway. It was bound in untreated linen, yellowed with age and faintly damp to the touch. The material smelled like basements that have forgotten electricity. When I lifted the cover, dust didn't rise. The contents felt preserved in moisture, instead of dryness. Inside were loose folios, fragments of vellum, layered paper repairs stitched together with threads from different historical periods. Some edges had been burned deliberately, not from fire damage but controlled scorching, removal through cauterization. At first glance, it resembled liturgical scripture. That assumption lasted less than a minute. Sermons persuade belief. Prayers plead upward. Hymns celebrate. This text instructed behavior. The language was structurally Latin, but the syntax was fractured in ways that felt like translation forced across incompatible meaning. Certain phrases repeated with slight variations, as if generations of translators had attempted to capture a concept that resisted stability. The title page was missing. In its place rested a scrap of animal parchment torn unevenly across one edge. The writing on it was charcoal, smeared slightly by age or trembling hands. It read, "This was never condemned. It was only interrupted." The phrasing unsettled me immediately. Condemnation suggests moral rejection. Interruption implies continuity waiting to resume. Each section began with procedural directives. Stand facing east. Do not kneel under any circumstance. Lower the voice during the 7th sequence. If tremors begin, maintain cadence. Do not speak the 3rd name aloud. The instructions repeated positioning, posture, breathing pace, and vocal synchronization with obsessive precision. The structure resembled safety protocols more than religious practice. And again, appearing between nearly every section, sometimes faded, sometimes rewritten darker by later hands, was the same line. So that it does not notice us. That sentence lodged in my thoughts like a splinter beneath skin. It assumed prior knowledge. It assumed danger existed not in summoning, but in detection. The margin notes were written in different hands spanning centuries. One annotation in faded brown ink read, "Volume exceeded tolerance. It stirred. Reduce resonance." Another written with sharp, impatient strokes. "Never perform with fewer than 3 voices. Singular recitation increases response probability." Further down, in meticulous Victorian penmanship dated 1897. "The ground answered tonight. We shorten the closing movement. God forgive us if shortening is worse." I remember my fingers tightening around the page at that entry. The writer had pressed so hard that the quill tip nearly pierced the parchment. The ink pooled where hesitation must have occurred mid-sentence. I should have stopped reading. I told myself professional exposure required familiarity with destabilizing texts. I told myself documenting this anomaly was my responsibility. I kept turning pages. The liturgy followed a progression that felt wrong on a symbolic level. Religious texts traditionally guide consciousness upward toward transcendence. This one moved downward, repeatedly instructing readers to lower posture, reduce volume, align closer to ground-level surfaces, and remain physically connected to stone or foundational architecture. One section required practitioners to place their palms flat against the floor during recitation. Another specified maintaining awareness of vibrations beneath one's feet. The final section ended mid-sentence. No blessing, no release, no doctrinal closure. Just a single line carved so deeply into the parchment, it had torn through multiple layered repairs beneath it. If interrupted, do not resume alone. That night, I dreamed in architectural detail. I stood barefoot inside a cathedral that had no ceiling. Instead, the structure spiraled downward in widening concentric corridors. The stonework became progressively older as I descended, Gothic arches dissolving into crude masonry, then into natural cavern walls shaped by erosion rather than design. The air smelled of mineral dampness and decomposing roots. My footsteps echoed downward instead of outward, each step producing a hollow reverberation that returned from depths I could not visually perceive. Somewhere below, voices recited words in overlapping sequences, slightly out of rhythm with one another, like multiple recordings playing through damaged speakers. I spoke one phrase, one I did not consciously remember learning. The ground vibrated softly beneath my feet. Not violently, like something shifting in its sleep. I woke abruptly, choking on air that tasted like soil. My apartment was silent. The city outside my windows hummed normally. But my hands were dirty. Compact earth packed beneath my fingernails. Thin strands of root fibers embedded in the soil, torn recently from living ground. I scrubbed my hands under scalding water until the skin peeled raw. The dirt did not smell like anything from my apartment building planters. It smelled like deep earth, cold mineral untouched by sunlight. The next morning, the folder was gone. Not relocated. Not archived. Removed from existence. There was no catalog entry, no intake log, no quarantine registration, no disposal documentation. My supervisor, whose memory borders on obsessive recall, insisted with visible irritation that no such material had ever entered restricted storage. I searched storage wings 3 times. I checked disposal incineration records. I reviewed cross-department transfers. Nothing, yet my desk still carried the faint smell of limestone moisture and decaying vellum. The scent clung stubbornly to the wood grain like residue left by something that had never physically existed long enough to leave residue at all. I decided to document the experience privately. Official reports involving unregistered materials often result in mandatory psychological evaluation and clearance suspension. I opened my personal notebook, intending to reconstruct the liturgy from memory for analysis. A single sentence already filled the top page. Written perfectly, copied word for word from the opening line of the missing text. I had no memory of writing it. My handwriting tilts slightly to the right, a habit from childhood penmanship training. The sentence in my notebook stood upright, rigid, each letter evenly spaced as if drawn using architectural drafting tools. Below it in darker ink, 2 additional words appeared. Continue. I stared at them long enough that my eyes began watering from lack of blinking. The pen lying beside the notebook rolled slowly toward the page, rotating just enough that its tip rested against the paper margin, as if waiting to be picked up. The overhead fluorescent light flickered once, then twice, then stabilized. From somewhere deep within the building, far below foundation level, A structural groan echoed upward through ventilation ducts and elevator shafts. It sounded like shifting bedrock, adjusting under redistributed pressure. The vibration traveled through my chair legs into my spine, subtle but unmistakable. I closed the notebook. The room fell silent. Then from beneath the tile floor I felt, not heard, something settle like weight repositioning across an immeasurable surface area. I stood slowly, forcing myself to step away from the desk. Every instinct urged me to leave the office entirely, to escalate the incident through proper channels, to place distance between myself and whatever chain of events had begun without authorization. Instead, I stepped into the hallway for air. I was gone less than 30 seconds. When I returned, the notebook was open again. A new line had been added beneath the first, written in the same steady, mechanical hand that matched my own only in anatomical possibility. The next section of the liturgy had been copied flawlessly from memory I did not possess. And beneath that line, pressed lightly into the page as if written by fingers without ink, appeared a second instruction. You have already begun. I tried to forget the words. I lasted less than 12 hours. For most memories, forgetting happens gradually. Details blur. Phrases distort. Emotional intensity fades into vague recollection. These words behaved differently. They did not sit in memory. They embedded themselves in reflex. I would catch fragments forming silently in the back of my throat, assembling syllables before my thoughts could intercept them. The first time I noticed, I was standing inside a commuter train, packed shoulder to shoulder with strangers whose conversations blurred into white noise. My hand gripped the overhead rail. My reflection hovered faintly in the dark window beside me. My reflection was whispering. I watched my own lips move through glass before I felt them moving on my face. The words were barely audible, nothing more than breath-shaping consonants against air. But the glass in front of me fogged instantly, condensation spreading outward in branching patterns that resembled script I almost recognized. The temperature around my ankles dropped sharply. A man beside me shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at the floor as if he had stepped into cold water. Another passenger pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, despite the overcrowded warmth of the train car. I clamped my mouth shut. The fog dissipated. The cold lifted. But the echo of the phrase remained in my ears, not as sound, but as pressure, like the memory of descending altitude during rapid flight. It happened again that evening in my apartment. Steam from the shower coated the mirror while I washed my hands. Again, though they were already clean, scrubbing instinctively as if soil remained embedded beneath the skin. Through the rushing water, I heard myself repeating a sequence under my breath. 3 syllables rising in pitch, followed by a pause that felt mechanically timed. The bathroom tiles vibrated faintly beneath my feet. Not movement. Resonance. The light fixture above me hummed in a frequency that made my molars ache. The vibration stopped the instant I bit down hard enough to interrupt the phrase forming in my mouth. I turned off the water and stood there shivering, watching condensation gather along the mirror's edges. For a moment, the droplets aligned into thin vertical streaks resembling handwriting. I blinked. The streaks scattered randomly again. Over the next several days, I began noticing patterns I could not explain. I paused in doorways without remembering why, my hand hovering over thresholds while my lips silently formed partial pronunciations. Elevators hesitated between floors when I exhaled certain vowel combinations. My apartment floors retained a deep, persistent cold that radiated upward through carpeting and settled into my knees when I sat. I started recording myself while sleeping. On the third night, playback revealed something that made my hands tremble enough to drop the recorder onto the floor. Beneath my breathing, faint whispers overlapped in 3 distinct tonal registers. They spoke fragments of the liturgy in imperfect synchronization, repeating incomplete phrases with patient repetition. 3 voices. I lived alone. After that, I stopped sleeping intentionally, surviving on caffeine and fluorescent lighting, hoping exhaustion would suppress subconscious vocalization. It did not. By the sixth day, the words began forming even when I was fully awake. They surfaced while reading unrelated documents, while answering emails, while chewing food. My tongue adjusted automatically to phonetic structures my conscious mind struggled to pronounce. I returned to the archives after closing hours. Access required dual authorization, environmental logging, and security escort for sub-level clearance. I bypassed each layer using administrative override privileges that would eventually flag my account. At the time, I calculated I had approximately 6 hours before automated compliance review detected anomalies. The elevator to the sublevels groaned as it descended, the cables producing a low harmonic vibration that matched the tonal baseline of the liturgy's opening sequence. I pressed my palms flat against the elevator wall, grounding myself, listening to the building's skeletal framework shift around me. The sublevels are not linear. Storage wings intersect across decades of architectural expansion, producing corridors that bend at inconsistent angles. Some shelves are deliberately mislabeled to obscure classification logic. Others contain collections technically removed from any formal record system. 3 levels below my clearance threshold, ventilation air grew colder and carried the scent of untreated stone. Behind a row of medieval hymnals, cataloged incorrectly as agricultural tax records, I found a hollow gap where shelving failed to align with load-bearing supports. Inside sat another compilation of the liturgy, and another beside it, and another partially disassembled, its folios stacked in chronological layers like sediment deposits, documenting centuries of attempted transcription. Each version ended at the same interrupted sentence. None completed. One volume was bound in a material I recognized instantly despite wishing I did not. Human skin. The pores remained faintly visible along the spine, preserved beneath thin preservation oils that caught the archive lighting with a dull sheen. When I opened it, the binding emitted a soft creaking sound that resembled knuckle joints flexing after long stillness. Inside, the first pages contained a confession written in early 17th century Latin. The translation formed in my thoughts with unnatural speed, bypassing the normal mental parsing required for historical dialect. The author identified himself as a parish priest assigned to a remote settlement in 1623. His handwriting remained precise, disciplined, even while describing events that suggested escalating terror. He described the ritual not as worship, as maintenance. "We do not praise it," he wrote. "We remind it that we are still here." His journal detailed tremors beneath the altar during recitation cycles, stone tiles subtly shifting alignment between sessions, candles extinguishing without drafts when vocal cadence deviated, echoes occasionally answering prayers before clergy completed them, correcting pronunciation through resonance that vibrated directly through their ribcage. The final entry described a night when one priest spoke a sequence out of order. Not loudly, not incorrectly, simply too early. The author wrote that the church did not collapse through explosion or structural failure. The building descended intact into the ground, sinking with unnatural smoothness as if the earth inhaled around it. Parishioners reported hearing the bell tower ringing faintly long after the structure vanished beneath soil level. His final line froze my hands around the page. "If you are reading this, it means the silence is thinning." I sat on the archive floor for an unmeasured length of time, listening to ventilation ducts carry low-frequency tremors that might have been machinery or distant geological settling, or something shifting position beneath layers of bedrock. That night in my apartment, I made a decision I have replayed repeatedly since. I continued the liturgy. Not aloud, not fully, just enough to connect 2 sections that had never historically been performed sequentially. The moment I completed the transitional phrase, air pressure inside my apartment thickened. My ears rang with the hollow sensation of rapid descent, though I stood perfectly still. The hardwood floor beneath my couch flexed slowly, producing a deep, stretching creak like beams adjusting under redistributed weight. My notebook lay open on the coffee table. The words I had written began shifting. Letters slid microscopically across the page, rearranging themselves into cleaner, more precise transcription. Diacritical marks appeared where none existed before. Entire clauses simplified into more efficient grammatical structures, as though centuries of human approximation were being corrected. Clarified, refined, less forgiving, understanding struck with nauseating certainty. Historical interruptions had never prevented completion. They had delayed it, waiting for someone isolated enough or compelled enough to continue alone. My phone vibrated against the table. Unknown number. No signal indicator. One message appeared. You are standing in the wrong place. The hardwood floor beneath my left foot cracked with a sharp, splintering pop, splitting varnish and exposing damp, dark subfloor wood beneath. From somewhere impossibly deep below the apartment foundation, I felt a tension shift. Not movement, awareness, rising slowly through layers of soil, concrete, and bedrock, with the deliberate patience of something that had measured existence in epochs rather than years. The apartment lights dimmed briefly, then returned brighter than before, casting sharper shadows across walls that seemed subtly misaligned, as if the room's geometry had adjusted by fractions too small to consciously measure. The message on my phone vanished. In its place, a blinking cursor appeared on an empty screen. Waiting. The crack in the floor widened slightly, revealing compact earth beneath the building's structural supports. The soil pulsed once, gently, like a heartbeat traveling through compressed ground. And for the first time since opening the original folder, I understood something with absolute, suffocating clarity. The liturgy was not a prayer seeking response. It was a signal acknowledging observation. And something beneath the foundations of human construction had just corrected my location, as if adjusting its focus. I understand now why the ritual requires multiple voices. It is not a prayer. It is camouflage. The overlapping tones are designed to fracture attention, to scatter recognition across layered frequencies, so that whatever listens beneath us perceives humanity as disorganized, distant, and harmless. The liturgy is not reverence. It is negotiation disguised as submission. The thing beneath the churches, beneath the earliest stones ever placed by hands trying to mark territory against wilderness, does not sleep. It listens. It counts. It remembers the precise moment it was first noticed. The ritual does not summon it. Every instruction exists to reinforce the illusion that we remain too small to register as intentional sound. Each syllable, each posture, each synchronized breath is crafted to convince something vast and ancient that we are nothing more than background vibration across the surface of a world it barely acknowledges. Every interruption throughout recorded history was not failure. It was mercy. Each collapsed cathedral, each vanished monastery, each unexplained sinkhole swallowing sacred architecture whole, those were decisions. Generations choosing silence rather than risking completion, leaving fragments of the liturgy scattered across centuries like broken locks, delaying a door that must never open completely. And now, by negligence or inevitability, the final sequence has found me. The last page appeared on my desk 2 mornings after the message on my phone. No ink marked its surface. The words were formed through deep indentations pressed upward from beneath the paper fibers, visible only when angled toward light. When I traced them with my fingers, the impressions felt rough, uneven, as if forced into the page by pressure from the opposite side rather than written from above. The final instruction contained only 6 words. Finish facing downward. Since reading that sentence, gravity has felt unreliable. My sense of orientation drifts unpredictably, especially when standing on polished floors. Sometimes I wake convinced the ceiling lies beneath my bed, and that if I step forward carelessly, I will fall into open subterranean space rather than cross my apartment. The archives began evacuation procedures within 48 hours. Official announcements cited structural instability, minor seismic tremors, infrastructure fatigue, Engineers installed monitoring sensors across foundation pillars and claim the vibrations measured below acceptable danger thresholds. They do not hear what resonates through the sublevels after midnight. They do not recognize the rhythmic expansions and contractions traveling through the building's structural supports, like breathing from an organism too large to identify itself as alive. I gathered 3 voices. Finding them required choosing people already standing near the edge of disbelief. The first was an acoustics researcher, specializing in harmonic resonance in ancient religious architecture. He recognized the tonal layering in the liturgy immediately and grew pale before agreeing to assist. He refuses to describe what he believes the harmonic structure accomplishes, but he continuously measures ambient frequencies as if trying to map something that refuses dimensional boundaries. The second was a historical linguist specializing in Proto-Indo-European phonetics. She insisted certain consonant clusters within the text could not be produced using normal vocal cord tension without inducing physical pain or temporary airway constriction. She still volunteered, rewriting pronunciation guides with trembling precision. The third voice belongs to someone who has not spoken their real name since agreeing to participate. They claim names are points of orientation, and orientation has become unreliable. We met beneath the oldest church in the city. Renovation records state its original crypt was sealed during structural waterproofing in the 1930s. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted during modern restoration revealed empty chambers beneath the subbasement that were never excavated or documented. We entered through a maintenance shaft hidden behind disused electrical panels. The descent ladder smelled of rust and mineral decay. The deeper corridors displayed stonework transitioning gradually from human masonry to natural cavern formation, exactly as I had seen in my dreams. The acoustics researcher continuously adjusted handheld recording equipment. The display screens flickered erratically, mapping resonance patterns that resembled echolocation diagrams of enormous hollow spaces, extending far deeper than geological records allow. The linguist transcribed last-minute phonetic corrections into my notebook. Her annotations grew tighter, overlapping earlier notes until entire margins appeared filled with spiraling script resembling containment diagrams rather than language. None of us spoke casually once we descended. Sound behaves differently here. Even whispers seem to fall downward rather than travel horizontally. Our footsteps echoed long after impact, returning with delays that suggested depth far beyond the visible cavern. I feel it beneath us now. Vast, patient, not hostile, simply aware that statistical irregularities in surface noise patterns are approaching recognition thresholds. If we fail tonight, the liturgy will not end. It will fracture, spreading through collapsing infrastructure, seismic fractures, and geological shifts that will continue the negotiation without human voices, spoken through the movement of continents rather than language. I began recording this confession because historical fragments suggest documentation, sometimes survive structural descent. The 1623 priest's journal was recovered from soil layers centuries after his church vanished. Paper apparently occasionally escapes burial when words inside it remain unfinished. The final chamber revealed itself when a collapsed stairwell exposed a circular stone platform worn smooth by centuries of ritual movement. Concentric grooves carved into the floor radiated outward from a central depression filled with black, reflective moisture that remained perfectly still even when disturbed by falling debris. We positioned ourselves along the eastern arc of the chamber. 3 voices. Aligned breathing. The acoustics researcher activated recording equipment, his hands trembling enough that the microphone cable brushed stone repeatedly, producing echoes that traveled downward for far longer than physical distance should permit. We began. The opening lines emerged with unnatural fluency, syllables flowing through vocal cords as if memorized by ancestral reflex rather than conscious study. The cavern air tightened immediately, pressure condensing around our heads and pressing inward against eardrums. Halfway through the second section, the ground pulsed once. Slow, Immense, a vibration resembling a heartbeat transmitted through tectonic mass rather than biological tissue. The linguist faltered for a fraction of a second. I felt her hesitation vibrate through the harmonic layering, threatening synchronization. She corrected instantly, voice tightening to match our cadence. We continued. The third section required volume reduction to near silence. Our voices merged into vibration more than audible speech. The moisture within the central depression began forming concentric ripples responding directly to phonetic rhythm, each syllable producing wave patterns that intersected with geometric precision. The acoustics researcher dropped one of his sensors. The impact echoed downward endlessly, returning as a distorted reflection that layered beneath our recitation like a fourth voice, speaking too slowly to understand. We reached the final instruction. All three voices must descend in pitch simultaneously while lowering our gaze toward the floor. Finish facing downward. I felt it listening directly beneath my feet now. A vast cognitive presence stretching through miles of subterranean darkness, focusing upward through fragile layers of stone, waiting to confirm whether humanity still understood how small it must remain to survive. We spoke the final syllable together. For one suspended moment, absolute stillness consumed the chamber. Even the ambient dripping of mineral condensation ceased, as if gravity itself paused to observe completion. Then the moisture in the central depression began rising. Not splashing, not flowing, lifting as a perfectly smooth column, its surface reflecting distorted silhouettes of our bodies bending inward, stretching vertically into elongated shapes resembling buildings collapsing in slow motion. The acoustics researcher staggered backward, whispering that his equipment was detecting resonance frequencies deeper than continental shelf baselines. The linguist began muttering phonetic corrections we had never rehearsed, her voice cracking as if forced to articulate sounds beyond human anatomical comfort. The floor shifted, not violently, deliberately, like something beneath us, adjusting posture after centuries of stillness. Warm air exhaled from fractures along the chamber walls, carrying the smell of ancient compressed soil and mineral decay older than recorded civilization. The stone beneath our knees softened slightly, yielding, descending by fractions of an inch. And in that slow, sinking moment, realization settled into me with irreversible clarity. The negotiation had not ended. It had accepted our completion as acknowledgement. The moisture column expanded, reflecting not just our bodies, but thousands of faint silhouettes layered behind us, forms resembling earlier practitioners across centuries, their outlines stretching downward into darkness like sedimentary history trapped within liquid mirror. The third voice, the one who never shared their name, began whispering something new. A phrase not contained within the liturgy. The acoustics researcher screamed for them to stop. The linguist clutched my arm hard enough to bruise, her voice collapsing into sobs while repeating that additional phonetic sequences were forming spontaneously in her mind. The chamber descended another inch. Dust fell from the ceiling in slow spirals, drifting downward longer than gravity should permit. The moisture column tilted slightly toward us, its reflective surface smoothing into unnatural clarity, revealing something far below, movement across an expanse too large for comprehension, shifting with geological patience. The unnamed voice continued whispering. The resonance changed. The ground responded. And as the stone beneath us softened further, as the chamber walls inhaled once more with cavernous breath, I realized the most horrifying truth contained within the liturgy. It was never designed to end. It was designed to keep humanity small long enough to delay recognition. And now recognition had begun. The floor sank another fraction. The moisture column widened, reaching toward our reflections with slow, deliberate curiosity. The acoustics researcher collapsed to his knees, ripping the batteries from his recording device as if silence might reverse attention. The linguist pressed her hands over her ears, but the new phonetics continued forming inside her throat against her will. The unnamed voice finally spoke clearly, their whisper cutting through the chamber with terrible precision. It knows we're still speaking. The ground pulsed again, stronger this time, and deep below, something ancient adjusted its focus upward, no longer pretending it could not hear us.